you should perhaps stop trying to be the best, because it may just be killing your visibility and costing you deals. I've seen consultants and established professionals who compete on being the best lose out to whoever has the more credentials, the more case studies, the more reassurance, and it basically becomes a willy waving contest. So I've been doing this for 25 years. I've seen people undersell themselves, especially recently. So now I'm going to show you exactly what creates irreplaceable positioning. So welcome, I'm Mike, I'm a brand storyteller. I help established professionals move from being invisible experts to recognised authorities. And for the last few years I've worked with a number of consultancies and professional service providers who have the expertise but just can't seem to win against the safer choice, So today we're going to talk about why being the best is actually perhaps not the best positioning and how you actually win deals. Because when you position yourself as being the best, well, you're competing on the same dimensions, the same level as everybody else. You're just the same as everybody else, except you might be a bit bigger or a bit smaller. The moment you're being compared on the same criteria, and you've already lost to whoever has more credentials, more case studies, and more reassurance. So, what would it be if you could create a category of one, basically? Because when prospects compare you to the bigger firms or on expertise, you enter what is called the commodity trap. You're listening to the same evaluation criteria you're losing the same evaluation criteria for everyone. You become interchangeable. You become a number. You become a service provider, just with different price points and team sizes. And the bigger firm will always win because they're the safer choice. They may have more social proof, they've got more financial muscle or whatever, they've got more. So I would suggest you're fighting the wrong battle. Brilliant consultants with 15, 20 years experience, better hands-on approaches, superior results, but they keep losing out on deals to bigger firms because prospects see them through the same lens. When you compete on expertise, credentials, case studies, you're asking to be compared on exactly the same dimensions where basically the bigger firms have more ammo. It's like a boutique restaurant trying to compete with Mackie D's on the number of locations they serve. It's a losing game. You're playing their game on their field by their rules. The key to this then is stop doing that. Stop competing on the dimensions where the bigger firms will always have more ammunition. Instead, you need to move the playing field onto an area where you are not compared to anybody else. So, if the best doesn't win, what does? What wins deals there isn't better expertise. It's a different framing of the problem itself. And that comes down to your story, basically. Your story is the only thing that makes you truly different. It's the only thing that no one can take from you. Everything else can be imitated. Everything else is replicable. So when you share your unique story, your journey, the mistakes, the pivot points, the boring background, you create something which is uniquely you. Prospects they're not just buying your expertise, they buy your unique perspective formed by your unique path. I'd kind of like to call this story discovery, but you can call it whatever you like. It's excavating the narrative that positions you in a category of one. I've got a rich and varied background. For 20 odd years, or perhaps a bit less than that, I was a translator. So I lived in France for 20 years. I translated some pretty boring stuff, but I got bored with translation and I moved into copywriting. But I was still waiting to be ready all the time, waiting to tell my story. Someday I'd write a book, someday I'd find my voice. And then my mother died in 2020 and I was 62 at the time, 61. And I was looking through family photographs and it was basically my entire life on a screen. We don't have as many photographs as you do now, but I still had a few. Me as a kid, me as a teenager and stuff. But also seeing my mother when she was young, when she was very young, even before I was born, right up to the mid-80s. And then it really hits me. It says, this is no longer a rehearsal. My mother was 26 when I was born. And that's my yardstick. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? What am I going to do with the time I've got left? It's too late now to be getting ready, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right qualification, waiting for the right confidence level. No time to be getting ready, so I finally started writing about my self-doubt, writing about my imposter syndrome, writing about perpetually not being ready. And I realised that my boring background, the late starter, the translator, the perpetual apprentice, well, that became my positioning. Because I've done loads of things, which I won't talk about here, that made me interesting. People were interested in what I had to say. Because that answers my audience's real question is, well, can someone like me do this? Of course you can. Of course you can. Whatever story you've got, don't keep competing on the same things everybody else is competing on, because it's a mug's game, to be quite frank. Your so-called ordinary background, well, it contains stuff that other people will consider to be kind of quite extraordinary, to be quite frank. You could be somebody else's hero that you don't know yet. The experiences you dismiss are exactly what makes you relatable, irreplaceable, unreplicable. So if this is landing for you, if you resonate with this, well, just go and hit the like button, because it helps more established people help discover this perspective. And if you're an established consultant, professional provider, just wrestling with this exact problem, well, subscribe for new stuff on this unique, on authentic positioning, because I really believe in it. And I think if I have a purpose in life, it's to tell you, everybody, that you have a story to tell, whatever you may think. And this is where most people get stuck. They think, okay, I get it, I need to be different, but not the best. But how the hell do I do that? This is where the storytelling, the timeline approach, basically, to storytelling comes in. So, you differentiate yourself not by inventing anything new. You differentiate yourself just by looking into what is uniquely yours. Because we all have unique stories. We all have unique experiences of life. This is about pattern recognition, not creative fiction. Creative fiction, you'll get found out if you make stuff up. If you try and be something you're not, if nothing else, you're going to be unhappy. So, get your weapon of choice, a big sheet of paper, a spreadsheet. I use a Trello board, but whatever you like. And divide your life into 5-year chunks. And I'm including your early years in that, particularly when you're at school, because that's obviously when you learnt the most. So for each phase, identify what you were doing at those times, what you learned, the mentors you had, the turning points, because they are the most important things in stories. The enemies as well, why not? Because they're part of your reaction to those kind of people are important as well. Look for the threads, how did phase 1 prepare you for phase 2? What are the skills, for example, you use now that you learned when you were at school or in university when you did your degree or whatever you did, or the skills that you picked up in a job that 20 years later perhaps you still use. What are the patterns that emerge? These patterns will reveal your authentic positioning narrative, because you'll be able to put 2 and 2 together and make 4.5 perhaps. This was pointed out to me a number of years ago. I'm a copywriter now, I've been a translator, which informs the way that I write, because I speak French, I speak half decent Spanish, and I'm learning Italian because it's French country cousin. Before that, I was a travel agent, so I learned to develop in business travel, so I learned to develop relationships with people. Before that, I got a history degree, so I can work out what's important, what's not important. I can see trends and things like that. I could take it right back to my childhood when my father worked for the railways and we went to Spain every year. And the 5, 6, 7-year-old me saw other kids speaking French or speaking other languages. What was all this about? They must think in English, don't they? Don't know what you don't know. But that set me off on a journey where I've always had at least one other language in my head. That's just the way I work. So that's my common thread. What's yours? You'll understand cultural nuance. You'll help people say what they mean. It's not something a 30-year-old marketing grad can replicate, no matter how talented. My translation background taught me how to capture authentic voice and cultural nuance. It's something I came to quite late in life. I was in my late 50s really when I suddenly realised that this is really what I want to do. After so many years of not feeling good enough, this stuff helped me point out when business owners, the brilliant ones or the not so brilliant ones, they can't see their real value. My multicultural perspective lets me see narrative patterns that others miss. My late start gives me credibility with people who think that they've missed their chance. These grey hairs have got to serve some purpose, haven't they? It's not better, it's different, it's mine. And you are going to have exactly the same thing. Your experience, because nobody else has your experience, even if you think that it's not worth talking about, believe you me, it is. So start by asking, what have I survived that shaped me, and rather shaped how I see this problem? Your scar tissue is your story, and your story is your positioning. So, here's your homework. Sit down with, like I said, with your weapon of choice, your Trello board, your spreadsheet, your journal even. You won't get this all in one go. You'll remember the broad outlines and everything, but the beauty of it is filling in the gaps. But also then, once you've done most of this, write down 3 times when a prospect chose someone else over you. And ask yourself this question: were they comparing me on the best dimensions or the different dimensions? Because if it's the best dimensions, the years of experience, the team size, the case studies, you're perhaps fighting the wrong battle. Now ask yourself, what if my journey could have made that comparison irrelevant? And try this exercise. Message me on LinkedIn or wherever you find me. Ping me an email or something. because I do read the messages. Even put it in the comments if you like, So, just to finish off, if you're an established professional, just tired of losing deals to safer choices despite your greater expertise, I've created a free resource for you called How to Write About Yourself When You've Got No Idea Where to Start. We take you through this story mapping process and one or two other things as well. There's a link in the description. It'll take you a couple of minutes just to sign up for it, and then that will be the start of your journey towards telling your own story. So thanks for watching. If you want more of this stuff, well, like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.